Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a persistent narrative has emerged in Russian media, suggesting that despite the thousands of sanctions imposed on them, the Russian economy is doing just fine. Many even claim that it's in better shape than it was before the war began. To support these claims, people usually point to Russia's GDP figures, which are seemingly stable and even growing, depending on who you ask. And people also point to certain budget metrics that are thought to prove Russia's economic durability, even in the face of war. Assuming that you can trust such metrics, of course, is often a huge leap of faith. These numbers themselves are ultimately provided by the Russian government, which has every incentive to make things look significantly better than they really are. And it turns out that there are often major discrepancies between what Russia claims about their own GDP growth and what third-party observers estimate based on trade numbers with Russia that are reported from other nations. So, as you might guess, on closer examination, we find that the truth is far different than what the basic data being reported by the Russian government might imply. And in reality, this narrative based on shaky numbers dangerously oversimplifies and masks the potentially catastrophic situation in Russia's real economy. But how bad are things really? Even if one takes the leap of faith and accepts Russia's numbers at face value, it turns out that things are starting to look pretty dire for the Russian people, with many signals indicative of a looming banking and financial meltdown that becomes more and more likely each day that the war in Ukraine continues on. In this video, we'll examine this looming banking crisis in depth, including its causes and its potential impacts. That discussion begins with a broader look at Russia's wartime economy as a whole. This will set the important context, because as it turns out, Russia's wartime economy and their looming banking crisis are intricately connected. Today's episode was made possible by our sponsor, Incogni. If you're like me, you're sick of constant spam calls, junk mail, and advertising that seems to know more about you than your own spouse does. Incogni helps solve that problem. They address the source of many of these issues: data brokers. Data brokers are the guys who collect and sell your personal details, things like your name, address, phone number, and even your online browsing habits, which are then sold to anyone willing to pay. Marketers, background check sites, employers and landlords, or even health insurance companies potentially looking to raise your rates based on your online activity. It's a creepy practice, and what's worse, the data being sold isn't always even accurate. Imagine being turned down for a job or a rental, or paying more for insurance because of outdated or incorrect information someone purchased about you. Incogni can help reduce this risk by removing your data from hundreds of data broker websites, a process that might otherwise take you several hundred hours to complete. Then, they help monitor those websites to ensure your data doesn't come back. It's simple. You sign up, give Incogni permission to act on your behalf, and they get to work, finding, flagging, and demanding that your information be deleted. If you're ready to reclaim your privacy, now's the time. Use the link in the description and my code Icarus to get a massive 60% discount on your subscription. Thanks to Incogni for sponsoring today's video. When looking at Russia right now, many might assume that one of the primary issues is Russia's increased military budget and its role in overheating the economy. And to be sure, this is a major problem for Russia, but the way it manifests itself is, importantly, different than many people might assume, making the situation look much better than it really is, while simultaneously being much worse than it actually looks, just like Russia's supposed GDP growth. Looking at Russia's direct military spending reveals that it is high, even by official metrics, currently estimated to sit at around 6.3% of the country's GDP, which likely vastly understates the true reality. In contrast, the United States, for example, spends only around 3.5% of its GDP on defense, a level of military spending that is still often characterized as overly excessive. China, for its part, spends around 1.7% of its GDP on its military. In these terms, Russia's military spending is far above average, which is perhaps not so surprising, considering that Russia is literally at war. But when placed in a broader historical context, Russia's numbers, at first, don't actually seem that high, and at least appear to be highly sustainable. For comparison, during World War II, the numbers spent on military action were much, much higher, and were able to be sustained for a number of years. At the peak of the war, the Soviet Union was estimated to be spending 50 to 60% of its GDP on the military, a figure close to 10 times higher than what Russia is spending today. Nazi Germany, for their part, went from 11% of GDP spent on the military in 1936 to 25% in 1939 to 75% in 1944. And at its peak, even the United States was estimated to be spending 40% of its GDP on the war. These numbers are rather extreme. Just imagine if half of the dollars you earned went straight to military production before you even got to spend a penny. So for a wartime economy, spending 6.3% of your annual GDP on your military, like Russia is currently doing, doesn't actually seem very high in context. And that's exactly what Russia wants the world to think. However, when you examine Russia's indirect war spending, you begin to see a very different picture. One with very drastic consequences, but that at least in the short term is easier to keep concealed from the public eye. You see, what is creating the threat of a banking and financial meltdown in Russia is an abnormally high level of indirect war spending through Russia's commercial banks. Or, to put it in better words, Putin and his government have been able to make Russia's direct war spending look incredibly low by strangling Russia's entire banking sector to fund the war against their will. This has prevented much of the true cost of the war in Ukraine from showing up directly in the Kremlin's coffers and balance sheets, and pushed that cost instead to more amorphous numbers like inflation, which far fewer people understand. The silent scheme has allowed Putin to do what is essentially equivalent to stealing funds from Russia's banks, frustrating Russia's richest and most powerful men, something that is now reaching a level which even Putin himself likely never anticipated. Thus far, this approach has helped Russia stay in the fight, but it has also, understandably, been incredibly straining for the banking sector. Russia has effectively been an immobilized wartime economy, without much of the population even realizing it. For the first few months and years, this bank exhaustion could be masked and even ignored to a large degree by Putin himself. But he likely never thought the war, and the pressure on the banking sector, would last this long without anything to show for it in return. With Russia's commercial banks now having been strangled for almost 3 years without any respite, they're starting to lose their breath, and Russia is getting closer and closer to the point where this crisis can no longer be ignored. In fact, it's looking increasingly likely that the entire banking sector could experience a full-blown collapse. Let's look at how this crisis has built up so far. The roots can be traced back to a law that Putin enacted right after his full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Even then, when he thought his war would be over quickly, Putin knew from the beginning that it would be expensive, and that even if he was successful in conquering Ukraine, Russia might then need to protect their newly enlarged borders, and to combat the predictable long-term insurgencies that would arise. It's also highly possible that Putin planned to do a quick turnaround and invade other former Soviet countries if his plans were successful. All of these things would require a quick and massive Russian military buildup. So Putin wanted to quietly build Russia into a wartime economy with as few people as possible realizing what was going on. The new banking law following the invasion aimed to help with all of this, through a clever trick. The law allowed the Russian government to force commercial banks to give preferential loans to war-related businesses. The key word here is forced. The law mandated that these loans be made at terms that were dictated by the state, and not the normal banking terms that would be based upon the anticipated risks and rewards of the banks. Just imagine if your government could take your savings account and force you to give it all to defense contractors, with a promise that you would be paid back eventually. Not by the government, but by the defense contractor. And you'll understand at a small scale what's really going on here. Because of this law, Russia's banks have been forced into loans that are incredibly risky. Actually, risky would be an understatement. Wartime production, of course, isn't the most sustainable business plan. At the end of the day, the products being financed are being sent to battlefields to be destroyed, rather than being used as permanent capital that can produce income. And once the war ends, defense companies that are no longer needed can simply close up shop, leaving the Russian banks high and dry. Due to these risks, under normal circumstances, these loans probably wouldn't even get approved. And even if they were approved, these riskier loans would typically come with much higher interest rates to compensate the banks, and certain safety clauses to protect them. Even with these measures, the loans might still be considered too risky. But they didn't have any of these measures. Because again, the loans were required by the government. The terms of these loans were state mandated, and the goals were totally aligned towards enhancing wartime production, with little to no thought towards profitability for the banks. Russia's banks have then basically been forced to make loans to defense contractors that they know full and well will never be paid back. Putin's goal was essentially to use Russia's commercial banks as his own personal war chest, taking their money to fund his war. In turn, this would give Putin's war economy far more economic resources, helping to vastly expand Russia's military production capabilities beyond natural levels that the government could maintain. Simultaneously, this weakened the financial positions of some of Russia's most powerful men, bringing them even further under Putin's thumb. And since the costs and the risks would be carried by Russia's commercial banks, and not the Russian government directly, this would help shield the Kremlin from having to show the real large-scale budget deficit that the country was effectively accumulating. People care far more about a federal budget deficit than they do about some greedy bank taking a loss or going bankrupt, after all. Most would never even notice what had happened. It's the kind of thing you would expect from a Soviet-style command economy, but not from an economy like Russia that at least tries to pretend like it holds to a free market system. In the United States, banks would fight back against requirements like this with a full-out media war against the administration. But Putin wasn't too worried about that, because in Russia, the Russian state controls the media and the messages that are legally allowed to get to the public's ear. Since the topic itself is so complex, Putin could be reasonably sure that with no information allowed to go out, pretty much none of the Russian people would actually realize what had happened. The cumulative amount of these forced loans has been massive, especially by Russian standards, ranging between 210 and 240 billion US dollars, or approximately 10% of Russia's total GDP, that has been forcibly given to Russian defense contractors outside of the Russian federal budget. This number is close to half of Russia's total annual budget, meaning that if the Russian government had borne these costs directly, instead of through the banks, their current budget deficit would be magnified by a massive multiple. By doing things this way, the Kremlin was able to effectively hide half of the cost of the war from the public eye. It's widely reported, of course, that the war has so far cost Russia between 200 billion to 240 billion US dollars. But with the forced bank loans accounted for, that number actually jumps to potentially as high as 480 billion US dollars, close to $500 billion, an astonishingly large figure. In some ways, Putin's plan has worked. With more resources, the wartime economy has been able to expand and produce more, in the short term. But this scheme has also completely wreaked havoc on the banking sector, leading to a potential financial meltdown that impacts not just the banks, but the entire Russian populace. Even Vladimir Putin knows that this banking scheme isn't sustainable, and he probably even had that in mind when he passed the law allowing it. As we mentioned earlier, Putin never thought his war would last quite this long with no rewards to show for it. After Putin originally invaded Ukraine, detailed Russian battle plans were intercepted, revealing that Russia initially thought the hot phase of their war would be over within just a few days to just a few weeks. This too meant that most of the economic preparations Russia made, including the forced bank loans, were likely intended to be temporary and short-lived, and perhaps even just a backup plan. But with the war now progressing into its third year, Putin is now being forced to face the early warning shots of this looming banking crisis. While the ticking time bomb hasn't fully gone off yet, early signs of what's coming are already visible. Most notably, the surge in money circulation from these forced loans, coupled with high direct military spending, has helped push inflation to extreme heights. Officially, inflation in Russia has jumped from 2.3% in early 2022 to to 9.5% by December 2024. However, it's important to note that these figures are almost certainly manipulated, and the actual inflation is usually estimated at closer to 25% or even higher. This inflation has been catastrophic, not only because such high inflation is inherently destructive due to the erosion of the average person's purchasing power, but also because it's forced the Russian central bank to drastically raise interest rates to stop inflation from spiraling out of control. We covered exactly how that works in a previous video on this topic, if you're curious. But for today's video, we're going to analyze things from a different angle. Suffice it to say that while raising interest rates to cool an overheated economy can make sense, it has extremely damaging consequences when applied to a stagnant country like Russia, because higher interest rates only make it even harder for the already struggling private economy to grow. In early 2023, Russia's interest rate stood at 7.5%. Now, it's skyrocketed to 21%. This is ridiculously high, more than 4 times the interest rate in the US and EU. And this high interest rate is essentially choking what's left of Russia's businesses, as when borrowing becomes more expensive, people spend less, so businesses grow less, and the entire economy slows down. This combination of economic dilemmas makes the crisis extremely difficult to address, since Russia's economy is experiencing 2 things that, under normal circumstances, would be mutually exclusive, that being stagnation and high inflation, otherwise known as stagflation. And just as inflation and stagnation are normally mutually exclusive, so are their solutions. You see, typically when an economy stagnates, it can be revived by the government stimulating the economy through a lower interest rate and investments. However, because Russia is experiencing high inflation for other underlying reasons, the Russian central bank doesn't have this option to release the pressure. Lowering interest rates to stimulate the economy and address the stagnation would risk causing inflation to spiral even further out of control, which could on its own create a massive crisis. But conversely, because of stagnation, Russia is taking a major risk whenever they increase their interest rate to combat this inflation, discouraging spending and potentially making their stagnation even worse than it already is. It's a catch-22, and there are no easy ways out. In a healthy economy, this scenario shouldn't be possible. Stagflation usually only occurs when there's something deeper that's wrong with the economy, often a structural issue. In order to break an economy free from this vicious cycle, this structural issue must be addressed before all else. In Russia's case, the structural issue is pretty obvious. Their entire economy has been geared towards their war against Ukraine, with a clear example being found in their forced banking loan scheme. So, for this banking and financial crisis to be solved, or in better words, made more manageable and survivable, Russia would first and foremost have to end their war. And we're not just talking about a temporary peace treaty here. They would need to end their war so completely as to cut military spending, allowing them to repeal the forced loans law and give their banks some breathing room. Simultaneously, they would need to strike a deal with the West to lift key sanctions and start their nation's road to recovery. And while the actual occurrence of Russia's economic crisis is probably unavoidable at this point, the severity of the fallout will depend on how quickly Putin decides to end the war, or if he even does at all. Now, since it doesn't look likely that Putin will take any major steps towards ending the war for the foreseeable future, there are really only 2 questions left to ask. First, how will this banking crisis likely play out? And second, what will the potential fallout be? To answer these, we can look at the 2 potential paths the crisis might take. Let's look at them one at a time. The first scenario is the less likely one. In this scenario, a banking crisis could be sparked by the Russian populace making a run on Russia's banks. It could be that, as inflation continues to rise, the Russian people will start to realize that an economic crisis is becoming more likely. In turn, they could respond by beginning to withdraw their savings from Russia's banks to protect themselves and avoid their funds being frozen. Actually, this is already happening at a moderate scale. But if enough people were to start doing this, it could trigger a tipping point that causes a panic withdrawal across the entire country, potentially leading to countrywide bank runs and ultimately sparking a wider banking and financial meltdown, with further knock-on consequences that we'll get into in a second. However, as I mentioned before, this first path is the less likely one. That's because, as all of my viewers probably know, the Russian government is highly adept at suppressing information. The Kremlin is unlikely to allow news analyzing the consequences of soaring inflation to reach the public at large without substantial obfuscation by Russian media personalities. And if popular communication channels began implying things that could lead to a widespread bank run, the Kremlin would almost certainly actively crack down on any attempts to spread news of this looming crisis, much as they have suppressed information about the war in Ukraine in general, resorting to imprisoning journalists and even putting people in prison who simply call the war, well, a war, rather than a special military operation. So let's then look at the second scenario, which is far more likely. This second possible scenario is that the Russian banking system simply collapses. This may sound dramatic, but it's not at all unprecedented, and it doesn't seem at all unlikely, considering that the Russian banking sector has pretty much been in a chokehold that has gotten progressively worse ever since the invasion of Ukraine began. As the war's costs continue to compound for the banks, and the losses from forced loans keep growing, some banks may eventually be unable to withstand the strain and may begin to fail, especially when government funds stop flowing into their coffers. And because of how intertwined the banks and the broader economy are, it's very likely that a chain reaction would then naturally take place. Eventually, this could send the entire Russian economy into a full-blown crisis. It's happened before. Now, whichever one of these two paths this crisis takes, or even if it took a different, unforeseen path, the results would be catastrophic for Russia. At home, people would lose their savings, businesses would collapse, and consumption would drop to rock-bottom levels. Jobs would then vanish, and millions of Russians would find themselves in dire economic circumstances. Trust in the government would erode rapidly, leading to widespread political instability. But the fallout wouldn't stop there. This type of economic crisis would almost certainly alter the war in Ukraine, and that's because the war in Ukraine is one of attrition. And wars like this require an economy that is capable of replacing equipment losses and keeping the military well supplied. If the Russian economy were to collapse, if banks stopped existing that were required to give unprofitable loans to Russian defense firms, and therefore replacement gear stopped arriving at the front line, well, the results are predictable. Because of the high losses that Russia is suffering on the battlefield, the front line would quickly run out of tanks, vehicles, ammunition, and all kinds of weapons, faster than it already is. And then, fairly quickly, the Russian positions would simply not be able to hold, and the front line could quickly begin to crumble. This exact scenario is why so much of the war effort against Russia, both by Ukraine and by their Western partners, has focused on economic aspects. Because at the end of the day, economic warfare is still effective warfare, although its consequences take longer to play out. There's also a more subtle, yet even more dangerous issue for Putin here, and it's that Russia's army in Ukraine is largely made up of individuals who are motivated by personal enrichment. They're not fighting out of loyalty or ideology. They're there because they're getting paid very well to do so, especially by Russian standards. So, if inflation starts to eat into their paychecks, or worse, if the Russian government has to delay payments, their motivation to fight would disappear. At best for Putin's case, the morale of the soldiers would plummet. At worst, we could see mass desertions and the front line breaking completely apart. So, Russia's war effort is creating the conditions for economic collapse, while that same potential economic collapse, in turn, is threatening Russia's war effort. A vicious and inescapable cycle. As discussed earlier, the only real way for Putin to avoid the most critical consequences mentioned here is to address the root problem of this crisis, that being by ending the war and the financial burdens that come with it. And interestingly, because this is the only way out for Putin, it could give Ukraine significant leverage in future negotiations when they eventually do take place. Because Putin, who is undoubtedly aware of how precarious his economic situation is, might eventually feel pressured to accept more compromises than he'd ideally like to in order to stop the bleeding, no matter how strong of a face he gives for the international cameras. While he's refused to do this so far, if more signs emerge that the crisis is imminent, and things like bank runs in Russia begin in force, Putin may start to feel that his power at home is at risk, including the future of his regime and even his own life. Under such circumstances, he would have no choice but to make concessions. Because while Putin desperately wants to win in Ukraine, at the end of the day, what he wants even more than that is to maintain his power at home in Russia, and to stay alive. Only time will reveal what Putin really decides to do, and the exact details of a Russian banking crisis. However, one thing we can be certain of is that Russia's situation is becoming more precarious, not less. The longer the Kremlin continues their current course of action, the higher the risk of Russia facing a full-blown financial meltdown. There's a lot more to say here about Russia's economy. So, if you want to learn about other underlying issues that are working in combination with those discussed in this video, check out one of these two videos here on screen.